Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, and talking now about the Eagles and their one of their star young players in their team, Jalen Carter. Really surprised a lot of people, especially myself, last year, in how really just seamlessly he transitioned into the NFL from Georgia. As a rookie, he recorded 6 sacks, 33 tackles, 8 tackles for loss, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble return touchdown in 16 games. Really just hit the ground running right out of the gate for the Philadelphia Eagles. And with all the depth that they had on their defensive line, I think, it was a pleasant surprise, but he slowly started to become the starter there for the Philadelphia Eagles. And it came at a very good time just because obviously nobody could have predicted that Fletcher Cox was going to retire at the start of last season. But now, with Jalen Carter in there and Jordan Davis as well as support, I think you didn't want to see it happen, but having Fletcher Cox retire, I don't think puts Philadelphia Eagles fans in such a dire desperation for who would replace him. You have very good players there, very young players in Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis specifically to sort of carry that mantle now for the Philadelphia Eagles. But specifically staying on Jalen Carter here for a second, new defensive coordinator Vic Fangio really pointed out Jalen Carter as one of the stalwarts of this team and how he could really make an impact. And to do that, he wanted to focus on Jalen Carter's conditioning and just his overall shape of football getting into the season. He had a very good start of his rookie year, but then, as most rookies do, throughout the NFL season, they're not used to playing that many games. Most of them hit a wall, and that's where you see the sort of fall off where Jalen Carter sort of struggled there or didn't make as much noise towards the end of the season, sort of like most of the Eagles defense did as well. Jalen Carter was no different. Over the last 6 games, he only recorded 2 sacks and 2 quarterback hits on 12 pressures, so a pretty big difference there from the monster that he was in the first 11 games there in the NFL. Vic Fangio touched on it a little bit, really just wanting to challenge Jalen Carter to be more conditioned in order to play him a lot more since he's already got the talent to be out there. You just have to get him in football shape to be able to play more and more and really help out this team more and more. Specifically, Vic Fangio said, I'd like him to be a lot more conditioned than working on technical stuff and where we've been at all year. For the technical stuff, he sort of has it already, and Jalen Carter also added that he did more conditioning this offseason in hand with what Vic Fangio sort of challenged him there with, instead of doing like you see in the offseason, working on your hand positioning, working on timing, or just working on certain moves you want to get better at. Jalen Carter really made it a point this offseason to work on that. And just overall, I like the idea of Vic Fangio challenging Jalen Carter a little bit as well with the retirement, like I mentioned, of Fletcher Cox. The Philadelphia Eagles are certainly going to need it, and also Brandon Graham not being the same Brandon Graham you saw maybe 3 years ago, 2 years ago when they made the Super Bowl. He has certainly slowed down. I think this will probably be his last season with the Philadelphia Eagles, so he's sort of stepping back a little bit and now opening up the door for Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis to step up. And I think they're really going to need it because they're going to look to Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis to really maintain a constant pressure through the middle because of the factors of losing Hassan Reddick to, or actually trading Hassan Reddick to the New York Jets, technically, because they couldn't figure out a new contract for him, so they figured it would be best if they traded him. You move on from Hassan Reddick, and that would just by default require more pressure from the middle of the field, because I know you have Bryce Huff coming in to essentially replace Hassan Reddick, coming from the New York Jets to the Philadelphia Eagles, funny enough. But he only really had one breakout year with the New York Jets when he posted, I think, 10 or 11 sacks this past year. Then he earned himself, just based on last year, a decent contract with the Philadelphia Eagles. So that's all great. He is sort of riding that momentum from last year. But the question is if he could stay consistent with that. Since last season, not too many people heard of Bryce Huff or just saw him play at such a level that he did last year. So I still have some doubts around Bryce Huff if he could come in and right away produce like Hassan Reddick did for the Philadelphia Eagles in his time there. And because of that, you also have Josh Sweat on the outside as well, opposite of Bryce Huff. And seeing how he recovers after 2022, where Josh Sweat recorded 11 sacks and really had the best season production-wise of his career, he dropped that number to 6.5 sacks in 2023 and actually had a streak, an 8-game streak from week 10 all the way to the end of the season where he didn't record a single sack in any of those games. So obviously that can't happen for the Philadelphia Eagles if you want to compete in the NFC East and in the NFC, of course. And also you want some redemption from last season where you really left a bad taste in everyone's mouths if you're on that defensive side of the ball. You didn't look very potent as you did in 22, very disruptive, or just making plays like they did in 2022. So where does this all tie in, Jalen Carter? Well, it is just, the question now, is Jalen Carter's contribution the most vital, the most needed at this point in time for the Philadelphia Eagles? And I would probably say, weirdly enough, that I think it is. I think they need Jalen Carter now more than ever, which again is very weird to say because he's only been in the league 1 year. But because of where the situation the Eagles find themselves in, uncertainty with Josh Sweat, up in 2022, down season in 2023, can he keep it consistent for the Eagles? And also Bryce Huff, getting accustomed to a new team, a new system, new defensive coordinator, having a great season, but again, you'd want to see a consistency with him there. And also, he didn't play a lot of reps for the Jets as well, so he's going to have to play a lot more here. How does he keep that conditioning and that level of play up throughout all 17 weeks of the NFL? That's another question mark. So for me, to have Jalen Carter in there, I think that's the most vital piece of this defensive line for the Philadelphia Eagles, and I think they're going to need his contribution more than anybody else's, because if you can have one guy being that menace in the middle of the defensive line and getting all the attention from the offensive linemen, I think it would make it easier for Josh Sweat and Bryce Huff to get off of their blocks a little bit quicker if Jalen Carter comes in and picks up right where he left off at the beginning of last season compared to the end. And you also just have to get more from Josh Sweat and also Bryce Huff. You want to make it easier for them a little bit at the start to get acclimated, but you can't just have Jalen Carter carrying this team. It's not going to work if you're not getting pressure from the outside. So you can sort of withstand it a little bit to start, but then you need Josh Sweat and Bryce Huff to eventually get it clicking and contribute to this pass rush. A little bit of uncertainty, I think the most we've ever seen with this Philadelphia Eagles team in recent memory, because Howie Roseman does a great job of stacking up each offensive line and then the defensive line as well through the draft and whatnot. So right now, it's not that it's thin at the defensive line, but I think you don't have too much room now. The margin of error has slightly decreased compared to last season, where you could rotate Fletcher Cox and you could rotate Brandon Graham in. Jalen Carter was coming in. Jordan Davis was there. Now, Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox on the way out, or Fletcher Cox is already out of the organization. You don't have too much room now to maneuver and really mess up with here. These guys have to step up, and Jalen Carter, to me, is the main guy that will be the glue, that will be the catalyst to this entire defensive line working in 2024. Is it fair in his second year? Maybe not, but that is the situation the Eagles find themselves in. I think he can handle it. He is a great player, but he just has to execute it in this coming season. But that'll do it for that segment. We have one more to talk about on today's episode on how Deshaun Watson's doing with his shoulder rehab, where he is at this point in the offseason, and why this offseason could be the most important for Deshaun Watson and the Cleveland Browns in this Deshaun Watson era. So stick around. I'll provide the reasons to that in just a few seconds. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.